The city was already glittering when night fell, but 65 floors above the chaos of New York, Ethelgard glowed with a different kind of light. It wasn't the neon of Times Square or the headlights streaking across Fifth Avenue. This was the kind of light that came from chandeliers carved like frozen waterfalls, polished brass sconces that reflected every movement like liquid gold, and candles that burned on each linen-draped table as though time itself had slowed to watch them flicker. The restaurant was less a place to eat and more a temple to wealth, an altar where the powerful came not only to dine, but to be seen. The air inside was carefully curated, almost designed to intimidate. It carried the faint tang of lemon oil from the mahogany panels polished daily, the richness of aged leather clinging to the banquettes, and an almost imperceptible whisper of truffle oil drifting from the kitchen. Each element was deliberate, chosen to remind anyone who entered that this was not just dinner, this was status. And for those who sat at the tables sipping their Petrus or their Montrachet, looking out over the sweep of Central Park glittering like a jeweled quilt below, there was an unspoken understanding. They were not just eating above the city, they were above the city. Among them moved the staff, silent and precise, shadows trained to glide rather than walk. They never lingered too long at a table, never spoke unless spoken to, never allowed the invisible machinery of service to break the illusion of effortlessness. It was a dance, and none performed it better than Claraara Morrow. At 26, she had mastered invisibility in plain sight. Her hair, dark as wet ink, was pulled into a knot so tight it seemed almost severe, and her uniform was immaculate, starched white shirt tucked into the black apron that never once looked wrinkled by the end of her shift. Her posture was perfect, her movements clean, her smile polite but never too warm. To the eyes of the wealthy, she was exactly what she needed to be, useful, forgettable, a pair of hands carrying their food and their wine. But her eyes told a different story. Storm-colored, gray with flecks of blue, they were eyes that had once looked out over the gardens of Provence, that had once studied brushstrokes in galleries and learned to read the language of canvas and color. They were eyes that still burned, even when her body moved with mechanical grace. Patrons didn't see it, couldn't see it, but beneath the quiet mask, a fire lived there, a fire that no uniform could hide. Every time she refilled a glass before it was half empty, every time she cleared a plate without a sound, she wasn't just performing a duty, she was biding time. There was patience in her movements, the kind of patience that only comes when someone has lost everything and yet refuses to break. On the surface, Claraara was a perfect waitress in a perfect restaurant, but inside she was something else entirely. She wasn't just waiting tables, she was waiting for something bigger, something she couldn't yet name but could feel thrumming beneath her skin like an unspoken promise. And on nights like this, when the air smelled of power and the city lights glittered far below, she knew the truth with a clarity that made her chest ache. Somewhere, out there in this city, walked the man who had taken everything from her family, and sooner or later fate would bring him back into her orbit. She carried a silver tray into the dining room, her reflection catching in the glass wall that framed the skyline. For a fleeting second, she looked at herself, and the ghost of the woman she used to be flickered there. Then she turned, slipping between tables of men in tailored suits and women wearing dresses worth more than. And her apartment lease, her face serene, her body precise. No one at Ethelgard noticed Claraara Morrow that night, but the silence in her steps carried a truth the city would one day hear. She wasn't invisible, she was waiting. And when her moment came, when patience sharpened into purpose, even the walls of this sky-high temple would remember her name. The world remembered Jean-Luc Morrow as a name whispered in shame, but Claraara remembered him differently. To her, he was not the disgraced art historian splashed across headlines. He was the man who taught her how to see. Not just to look, but to truly see. The tilt of a brushstroke, the hidden story in a painter's choice of color, the way history itself was preserved in cracks of oil on canvas. When she was a child, summers in Provence were filled with museum halls and quiet gardens where her father's voice carried like music, full of life and wisdom. Her mother, Hélène, elegant and radiant in her French poise, completed the picture of a life Claraara thought unshakable. But 5 years ago, the world shattered. The painting was called The Alchemist's Daughter, hailed at first as a lost jewel of the Dutch masters, authenticated by none other than Jean-Luc Morrow himself. The art world gasped. Investors poured millions into it, and Jean-Luc's reputation soared higher than ever. For 6 fleeting months, he was at the pinnacle of his career. And then came the collapse. Scientific analysis revealed it to be a modern forgery, a fraud so cunning it fooled even the most seasoned experts. Newspapers devoured the story like wolves circling blood. Morrow the fool, the scholar who sold a lie. His reputation crumbled overnight. What the world never saw was the devastation inside their home. Claraara remembered the night her father collapsed, the stroke ripping away his voice, leaving him half paralyzed in a body that could no longer fight back against the storm of accusation. She read her mother weeping quietly, her health unraveling under the weight of scandal and the cruel whispers of former friends who vanished as quickly as they had once flocked. She remembered packing the last of their belongings into cardboard boxes, watching strangers carry away the family brownstone in an estate sale that felt like a funeral. She was 21, a promising art history student at Columbia, with professors already whispering about her brilliance, about how she might eclipse her father one day. But she didn't go back to class. She walked into the world of service jobs, faceless uniforms, and hard-earned paychecks. She traded brushstrokes for silverware, manuscripts for menus. The dream of scholarship was gone. What mattered now was rent, prescriptions, and the steady rhythm of survival. Yet even in survival, Claraara carried her father's words like a secret weapon. Patience is a blade. You must learn when to draw it. At Ethelgard, she perfected patience. Every shallow smile at an arrogant patron, every bow of her head to a dismissive hand, was a sharpening of that blade. No one saw her for what she was. To them, she was a server, anonymous, irrelevant. But inside her, a storm gathered strength year after year. She thought about it often during the quiet lulls between dinner rushes, how the powerful lived like gods, tossing scraps to those who brought them their feasts. She thought about the hypocrisy of wealth masquerading as culture, about how quickly her family's name had been discarded when scandal touched it. She thought about the man her father had accused in hushed tones, the business partner whose shadow had lingered over every memory of that cursed painting, Damian Sterling. The name still carried venom. And so she waited. She waited as she polished silver until her fingers burned, as she carried $12,000 bottles of wine to men who sipped them like water, as she listened to laughter that dripped with arrogance. She waited not because she was weak, but because she knew. One day, fate would bring her face to face with the man who had destroyed her family. One day, patience would no longer be a blade hidden in its sheath. It would strike. That night, as Claraara set another table and straightened the cutlery with mechanical precision, she caught her reflection again in the darkened window overlooking Central Park. Her eyes, those stormy, restless eyes, stared back at her with a question that trembled like thunder in the distance. When the moment comes, will you be ready to take it? And though she said nothing aloud, the fire inside her answered, yes. The hum of Ethelgard was steady that night, a low symphony of forks against porcelain, laughter pitched too high, and the occasional pop of a cork echoing off the polished mahogany. Claraara glided between tables as she always did, her tray balanced perfectly, her face serene. Nothing broke her rhythm. Yet when the glass doors at the entrance opened, she felt it before she saw it. The air changed, just a subtle shift, but enough to make her turn her head. Damian Sterling had arrived. He didn't enter the way ordinary men entered a restaurant. He moved like the room already belonged to him. 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, his custom Tom Ford suit cut sharp enough to draw blood, he strode forward with a predatory ease. The watch on his wrist wasn't just expensive, it was designed to be seen, its gleam announcing its own price tag to anyone within range. His hair was styled to perfection, his smile a thin blade flashing under the chandelier's glow. On his arm, Isabel floated like an ornament, breathtakingly beautiful. Her kin porcelain. Her figure delicate in a dress so dazzling it looked borrowed from a red carpet gala. She was the kind of woman who was meant to be looked at, but never truly seen, her eyes carrying the vacancy of someone who had traded depth for diamonds. "Sterling, party of 2, he announced, not to the hostess, not politely, but like a king declaring his court had arrived. Heads turned, a murmur rippled through the room. The staff straightened instinctively, as though they too felt the weight of his presence pressing down on them. Damian Sterling wasn't just another wealthy man dining at Ethelgard, he was one of the men who made this city bow. Claraara's stomach tightened the moment she heard his name. She knew it, of course. Who didn't? He was on the cover of Forbes, the subject of endless profiles in the Wall Street Journal. They called him a self-made titan, the architect of billion-dollar deals, the master of aggressive takeovers. To the world, he was brilliance wrapped in ruthlessness. To her, he was something else. Her father's voice haunted her, weak from illness but fierce with rage. That man, Damian Sterling. He believes there are two kinds of people in this world, people like us and people like them. The words rang in her ears now, almost too loud, as if her father were whispering them across the years. And there he was, the man who had turned her family into ashes, standing not 20 feet away, oblivious to her presence, exuding arrogance with every step. The hostess led him and Isabel to the corner banquet, the best seat in the house, with the panoramic sweep of Central Park glowing behind it. And by fate, or perhaps by cruel design, that table fell within Claraara's section. Her fingers flexed against the tray she carried. For 5 years, she had dreamed of what she would say if she ever saw him again. For 5 years, she had rehearsed every possible confrontation in the silence of her own mind. Yet as she approached the table, the weight of the moment pressed against her chest like a physical force. "Good evening," she said, her voice even, calm, betraying nothing. "My name is Claraara, and I'll be your server tonight. May I start you with some water?" Damian didn't look at her. His eyes stayed glued to his phone as he flashed Isabel something on the screen. He waved a hand dismissively as though shooing away a child. "Get us the 98 Petrus and don't shake it." His tone was curt, imperious, a command, not a request. Claraara kept her composure, though the name of the wine almost made her chest seize. $12,000 in a single bottle, ordered without a flicker of thought. "An excellent choice, sir," she said softly, her voice polite and neutral. She turned to Isabel. "And for you, madam?" Isabel blinked, almost startled to be acknowledged. "Oh, I'll have what he's having," she said quickly, her tone thin, like a child copying her lines. As Claraara walked back toward the cellar, she heard him again, his voice low, arrogant, the kind of voice that treated entire companies as disposable toys. He bragged about a takeover, about gutting jobs and flipping the remains for profit. Isabel giggled on cue, hanging on words that sounded like poison to Claraara's ears. She moved as she always did, efficient, invisible, but inside her stormy eyes a flicker of fire caught light. He hadn't recognized her. Not yet. To him, she was no one, just a waitress carrying his wine. But to her, this wasn't chance. This was the beginning. She balanced the bottle carefully, her steps smooth, her face unreadable. But with every breath she felt it building, the inevitability of collision, the sharp pull of destiny tightening like a noose. And as she returned to his table, the thought echoed in her mind like a steady drumbeat. He destroyed us once. He will not do it again. The Petrus poured like liquid rubies into Damian Sterling's glass, shimmering under the low golden light. Claraara's hands were steady, her movements precise, but inside her chest, her heart thudded like a war drum. She lowered the bottle to the decanter and stepped back, invisible once again. He swirled the wine, sniffed it with exaggerated theatrics, then took a sip. "Acceptable," he muttered, as though granting it mercy. Isabel giggled, a thin sound that clung to the air before vanishing. Claraara turned to leave, but something made her pause. The shift in Damian's voice, lower now, pitched not for the room but for Isabel's ear alone. He leaned close, the smirk on his lips sharpened with cruelty. And then came the words, broken and butchered in his clumsy French. "Regard," he sneered, his accent so heavy it made the language stumble. "Look at this poor little thing. She works all night for crumbs. I wonder if she's ever tasted anything better than scraps from the kitchen." Isabel's laugh was light, almost rehearsed. "Oh, Damian, you're awful." "C'est la vie," he said with mock sophistication, mangling the vowels. "There are people like us, and then there are people like them. She probably lives in some miserable little box in a borough I wouldn't even drive through." The words struck Claraara like a knife, but not in the way Damian intended. She had been insulted before, demeaned and belittled by men with too much money and too little soul. She had learned to let their words roll off her like rain on stone. But this was different. The cadence of his cruelty, the phrase "people like us," "people like them," it pulled her backward through time, to a night in her father's study, his voice raised in a fury she had rarely heard. "That man, Damian Sterling," he had hissed to her mother. "He believes there are only two kinds of people. People like us and people like them. And he thinks he can buy and sell the rest of the world for sport." The memory hit her with such force that her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers clenched around the tray until her knuckles whitened. Her father's face, ashen, furious, betrayed, flashed before her eyes. It had always been a shadow, a suspicion buried beneath years of grief. And now, here he was. The man who had destroyed her family sat less than 3 feet away, sipping $12,000 wine and mocking her existence in her mother's language. The restaurant around her blurred, the clinking glasses, the murmured conversations, the jazz notes floating softly above it all. Her body felt rigid, her vision narrowing until all she could see was him. Damian Sterling, predator in a suit, laughing at ghosts he didn't know were about to come for him. He expected her to remain silent. He expected her to bow her head, refill his glass, and scurry away. That was what he saw when he looked at her. A servant, a shadow, an object. But Claraara was no object. She was a storm contained too long, and now the first crack of thunder was ready to split the sky. She straightened, lifting her chin, her storm-gray eyes fixing on his with a clarity so sharp it made her blood hum. When she spoke, it was not in English. Not in the deferential tone of a waitress. It was in flawless, crystalline French, each syllable cutting like glass. "Monsieur," she said, her voice low but resonant, slicing clean through the private bubble he thought he'd built. Damian's smirk faltered. Isabel froze, confusion flickering across her painted features. "If you wish to critique my life in French," Claraara continued, her accent pure Parisian, the kind that carried generations of refinement, "I suggest you learn the language beyond the level of a tourist asking for a bathroom." The silence at the table was electric. Damian's glass trembled in his hand. The arrogance in his eyes cracked, replaced by something else. Shock, recognition, fear. Claraara leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping into a whisper, sharp enough to cut him open. "Your accent is as clumsy as your manners. And as for what I have or have not tasted, know this. I was raised in a world you only wear as a costume." She held his gaze, unblinking, her stormy eyes a mirror of everything he tried to bury. He saw her now, not as a server, not as a shadow, but as a ghost from the past rising to claim him. Then, as quickly as the storm had broken, she stepped back, her mask slipping seamlessly into place. She gave a small nod, her expression calm. "Please enjoy your caviar, sir." And with perfect poise, Claraara turned and walked away, leaving Damian Sterling pale, his arrogance shattered, his wineglass shaking in his hand. For the first time in years, the predator looked cornered, and Claraara knew. The waiting was over. Fate had finally brought the monster into her orbit. Damian Sterling sat frozen, the stem of his wineglass trembling between his fingers, the crimson liquid inside threatening to spill with every small shake of his hand. Isabel blinked at him in confusion, her smile faltering as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. The words still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Claraara's flawless French, her cutting rebuke, the way she had dismantled his superiority in less than a breath. No one else in the restaurant had heard the exchange clearly. The music played on, glasses clinked, laughter bubbled from another table. But at that corner booth, with the city glittering behind them, a silence pressed down like a physical weight. It was the kind of silence that could crush a man, the kind that turned his own arrogance into chains around his throat. Claraara's back was straight as she walked away, her steps measured, her tray balanced effortlessly against her hand. On the surface, she was once again the invisible server, but inside, her chest burned like fire. 5 years of humiliation, of bowing her head, of swallowing anger. Everything had condensed into that one moment of truth. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't lost her composure, yet she had cut Damian Sterling to the bone, and he knew it. She could feel his eyes on her as she moved through the room, eyes that once dismissed her now staring, trying to make sense of who she was. The arrogance had cracked, and in its place, she saw something far more satisfying: fear. He wasn't afraid of a waitress. He was afraid of recognition, of something lurking beneath her words that touched a memory he had tried to bury. Damian cleared his throat, forcing a laugh, trying to shake off the moment. "Ridiculous," he muttered to Isabel, though his voice lacked its earlier strength. "These servers. They forget their place sometimes." But Isabel's giggle was gone, replaced by uncertainty. She looked between him and Claraara's retreating figure, her painted smile trembling. Even she could feel it. Something had shifted. Behind the swinging kitchen doors, Claraara's legs carried her automatically, but her mind was a whirlwind. Her hands, usually steady, trembled just slightly as she set the tray on the counter. Sophia, polishing silver nearby, glanced up. "What happened out there?" she whispered. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Claraara's lips parted, but no words came. Her throat was tight, her heart hammering. A ghost, yes, but not of the dead. A ghost of the man who had haunted her father's every broken word, the man who had turned their name into ashes. And now, fate had sat him at her table. But she couldn't tell Sophia. Not yet. She drew in a deep breath, let it out slowly, and forced her hands still. She had revealed herself in a flash of lightning, but storms did not break in one strike. They built, they gathered, and when they finally unleashed, they destroyed everything in their path. She thought of her father, his once brilliant voice now reduced to fractured syllables, his hand twitching against the armrest of his wheelchair. She thought of her mother, pale and fragile, dozing with a book of French poetry open across her lap. She thought of all they had lost, friends, home, dignity, and she thought of the man now sitting in Ethelgard, rattled for the first time in perhaps his entire gilded life. Claraara's lips curved, not into a smile but into something colder. Patience had always been her weapon. Tonight, for the first time, she had drawn it. The blade was sharp, and she could feel it hungering for more. Out in the dining room, Damian Sterling shifted uncomfortably, his usual ease gone, his gaze flicking toward the kitchen as though expecting Claraara to reappear. He didn't know it yet, but his empire had already begun to crack. Not from hostile takeovers or rival tycoons, but from a single woman he had tried to humiliate in a language he thought she could not understand. And though no one else in the restaurant sensed it, Claraara did. This wasn't just an insult traded over caviar. It was the opening of a war, one that had been waiting 5 long years to begin. The storm had broken. The kitchen door banged open so hard it slammed against the stopper, the clatter jolting every cook and busser into silence. Mr. Dubois stood framed in the doorway, his sharp suit immaculate, his severe expression darker than Claraara had ever seen. His eyes scanned the room like a hawk searching for prey, and then locked on her. "Morrow!" he barked, his accent crisp, his voice cutting through the noise. "My office, now!" The chatter and clang of the kitchen stilled, the air thick with the weight of his tone. Every member of the staff froze for a breath, eyes darting toward Claraara with silent pity. Everyone knew what that kind of summons meant. Fired, immediate, uncompromising, no appeal. Sophia's face paled, her mouth opening as though to defend her friend, but Claraara lifted a hand subtly, silencing her. Inside, her chest tightened, but her face remained calm, her posture unbroken. She had known, the moment she spoke to Damian Sterling in his own mockery of French, that there would be consequences. But strangely, she felt no regret. If anything, there was a strange, dangerous calm in her veins, like the quiet that comes after thunder shakes the sky. She followed Dubois down the narrow hallway, her footsteps echoing softly against the tile. The hallway smelled of bleach and old paint, far from the curated aromas of lemon oil and truffle in the dining room. The further they walked, the more the hum of the restaurant faded, until only the sound of her own breathing filled the silence. His office was small, windowless, lined with file cabinets and a desk stacked with papers. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." Claraara did, folding her hand. Is in her lap, her back perfectly straight. Dubois steepled his fingers, staring at her with eyes that missed nothing. "Do you know why you are here?" His voice was low now, heavy with controlled anger. "Yes," she answered evenly. "Mr. Sterling is one of our most important patrons," he continued, his words sharp. "He has just informed the hostess that he was egregiously insulted by his server. He demanded your dismissal. He said you humiliated him, that you spoke to him in French with unacceptable disrespect. He has promised he will take this to ownership tomorrow. He says your career here is finished." The silence stretched. Dubois's gaze drilled into her, searching for weakness, for excuses, for panic. But Claraara only lifted her chin slightly. "I spoke to him in French," she said calmly. Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, not yet sympathy. Why? What could you possibly have said to provoke a man like Sterling so badly? Claraara inhaled slowly, her storm gray eyes steady on his. This was the moment where most servers would fold, would beg, would plead for another chance. But Claraara was not most servers. She had endured worse humiliation than this, and survival had stripped her of fear. "He was speaking about me to his companion," she said, her voice steady. "He assumed, because I wear this uniform, that I was uneducated and beneath him. He called me a poor little thing who survives on scraps from the kitchen. He mocked me, thinking I couldn't understand." Dubois leaned back slightly, his stern expression softening by a fraction. "And your reply?" Claraara's words slid from her tongue like ice. "I suggested that if he wished to insult someone in a language, he should endeavor to learn it properly first. I told him his accent was as clumsy as his manners. And I told him that while he plays at culture, I was raised in the world he only pretends to understand." The silence that followed was thick, a silence filled not with condemnation, but with recalculation. Dubois's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. Slowly, he set down the pen he had been tapping against his desk. "Morrow," he repeated, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "What is your story?" She held his gaze without flinching. My father is Jean-Luc Morrow. The name fell into the room like a stone into deep water. For a moment, Dubois said nothing. Then his brows lifted, his lips parting just slightly. Recognition, disbelief, then understanding washed across his features. He was French. He knew the name, the scandal, the man who had been both legend and disgrace. Mon Dieu, Dubois whispered, sitting back in his chair. The art historian, the scandal of the Vermeer forgery. The same, Claraara said softly. And Damian Sterling is the man who destroyed him. The weight of her words hung in the room. Dubois rubbed his chin, his sharp eyes darting toward her, seeing her anew. The grace he had always admired in her movements, the quiet strength in her composure. It suddenly made sense. She was not just another server. She was a fallen heiress, a woman born to a world far above the one she now served. Finally, he exhaled and leaned forward. Listen carefully. Sterling is powerful. He has money, connections, the kind of reach that can make life very difficult. But he paused, and for the first time that night, a flicker of respect softened his voice. You have something money cannot buy. Dignity, integrity, class. Claraara's throat tightened, but she held herself steady. Dubois's lips curved into the smallest, sharpest of smiles. You are not fired. Not tonight. Take the rest of the evening off. Go home to your family. And be careful, Mademoiselle Morrow. A man like Sterling, when humiliated, does not forgive. He retaliates. Claraara rose slowly, her heart pounding, but her face composed. She bowed her head once in gratitude. Thank you, monsieur. As she stepped out of the cramped office into the hallway once again, her breath came in a rush, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She had expected to walk away broken, discarded once more. Instead, she walked away with something else entirely, a strange, dangerous clarity. Damian Sterling had recognized her fire. He had felt it. And men like him, when afraid, showed their true weakness. This was not the end. It was the beginning. The subway rattled beneath the city, its fluorescent lights flickering against the metal poles and tired faces of strangers. Claraara sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, the scent of lemon oil and truffle from Ethelgard still clinging faintly to her uniform. But her thoughts weren't on the restaurant anymore. They were fixed on the moment Damian Sterling's smirk cracked, on the way his arrogance faltered when she spoke in flawless French. For 5 long years, she had swallowed humiliation, hidden her fury, and waited. Tonight, something inside her had shifted. The waiting no longer felt endless. The waiting now had a target. When she climbed the creaking stairs to their cramped apartment in Queens, the air met her with familiar comfort. The faint smell of lavender hung in the air, mingling with the older, warmer scent of stacked books and worn wood. Here, time seemed to move slower, as though the world outside hadn't crushed them beneath its weight. She found her mother asleep in the armchair by the window, a thin blanket draped over her lap, her breathing shallow but steady. An open book of French poetry rested across her chest, its spine bent from years of being read and reread. Ellen had once been a woman of striking grace, her laughter carrying through gardens, her voice commanding in elegant French salons. Now her hair was streaked with gray, her body fragile, her health tethered to bottles of expensive prescriptions. Claraara moved, softly, carefully lifting the book from her mother's chest and sliding a bookmark between its pages. She adjusted the blanket, tucking it gently around her, her storm-colored eyes softening. For a brief moment, she let herself remember the mother who once seemed untouchable, whose presence filled every room. Now she was like a candle flame flickering in a draught, delicate, threatened. The sound of the old clock ticking in the corner followed her as she crossed the small apartment to the back room. She pushed the door open quietly. Inside, her father sat in his wheelchair near the window, though there was no view to be had, only a brick wall rising from the alley below. His body had betrayed him years ago, half paralyzed from the stroke, his voice trapped in garbled syllables. But his eyes still burned with the brilliance of the man he had once been. He turned his head as she entered, and his gaze locked onto hers instantly. He could always tell when something had changed, when something inside her had shifted. Tonight, that gaze sharpened like a blade. She knelt beside him, taking his good hand in both of hers. For a moment, she simply held him, letting the silence stretch between them. Then she leaned closer, her voice low, steady, carrying every ounce of the fire she had contained at Ethelgard. "Papa," she whispered, her lips trembling around the word. "I saw him tonight, Damian Sterling." The reaction was immediate. Her father's hand convulsed in hers, gripping with surprising strength. His mouth opened and a guttural sound escaped, raw, angry, a sound he rarely made but one she knew well. Fury, recognition, pain. His eyes burned with the same storm that had carried through his lectures and filled galleries when he once commanded them. Claraara blinked back tears, pressing her forehead to his hand. He was there, at Ethelgard. He tried to humiliate me. He spoke in French, mocking me, mocking everything he thought I was. He didn't know who I was, but I knew him, and I didn't. Stay silent, Papa, I answered him. She told him everything, the butchered words he'd spoken, the way her reply cut through the air, the silence that followed. She recited it all in French, the language of their home, her voice steady, proud, fierce. As she spoke, she watched the change in her father's face, the shock giving way to something else, something deeper, pride. A single tear slid down his cheek, carving its way through years of bitterness and silence. His grip on her hand tightened until it almost hurt. For the first time since the scandal, her father's eyes were alive again, blazing with purpose. They didn't need words. His look told her everything. Good. It has begun. Claraara's chest swelled with something dangerous and unshakable. This wasn't just defiance anymore. This was war. The man who had stolen her family's name and turned it into a curse had looked her in the eye tonight, and for the first time, he had been afraid. As she rose, her reflection caught in the darkened glass of the window beside her father's chair. She didn't see the tired waitress anymore. She saw the storm her eyes had always promised. And for the first time in 5 years, Claraara Morrow did not feel like a victim of fate. She felt like its instrument. Claraara couldn't sleep. The city outside her window pulsed with restless energy, taxis honking in the distance, sirens slicing through the night air. Her mother slept in the chair, her father dozed in the back room, but for Claraara, the storm inside her was too loud. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands gripping the sheets, her mind replaying the moment Damian Sterling's smirk collapsed. It was like tasting air after drowning, brief, electrifying, but not enough. She needed more. Her gaze drifted beneath the bed, to the worn leather trunk she had not opened in years. She pulled it out slowly, the scrape of wood against floorboards echoing in the stillness. Dust coated the edges, the brass latches tarnished with time. This trunk was the last remnant of her old life, the one she had shoved into the shadows because it hurt too much to look at. With steady hands, she lifted the lid. Inside lay the wreckage of her past, old photographs from Provence, her Columbia textbooks filled with her scribbled notes, programs from museum galas where her father's name once drew applause. She set each item aside carefully, her fingers trembling, until she reached the very bottom. There, wrapped in a faded scarf that had once belonged to her mother, were her father's journals. She lifted them out reverently. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed at the edges, but his handwriting, elegant, looping, unmistakable, covered every line. Claraara pressed the first journal to her chest, her throat tightening before opening it. At first, the entries were what she expected. Detailed notes on pigments, observations about brushwork, references to obscure art historians. The words radiated her father's passion, his relentless pursuit of truth. But as the months drew closer to the scandal, the tone shifted. The script grew sharper, more agitated, as if even his pen had sensed the storm coming. Claraara's heart pounded as she reached an entry written 2 weeks before the catastrophe. Something is wrong with the lead tin yellow. The particle composition, it is too uniform, too perfect. It mimics the 17th century but lacks the natural imperfections of the era. This is not the hand of time, this is the hand of deception. Her eyes widened. She turned the page, devouring every word. I raised these concerns with Damian today. He dismissed them. He called me paranoid. He insisted this is our golden goose, that to question it now would be madness. His eagerness is unseemly, desperate. He has already pre-sold shares of the painting to investors. If it is exposed as a forgery, his empire collapses. He cannot allow that, but I cannot allow this lie to stand. The truth must come out. Claraara's breath hitched. She knew what came next. Her father's disgrace, the sudden appearance of a Swiss account, the doctored report. But to see it here, in his own words, made her chest ache with fury. Then she found the final entry, dated just 2 days before the scandal broke, the ink blotched in places as though his hand had trembled. I am certain now. This painting is a forgery, brilliant but false. The underdrawing reveals a cross-hatching in the sleeve. Unique, unmistakable. It matches the style of Han van Meegeren's student, a 20th century forger. I have prepared samples for independent analysis. I will confront Damian with my findings tomorrow. The truth cannot wait. Claraara's hands shook violently. Her father had found the truth. He had seen the signature of the forger hidden in the folds of the girl's painted dress. He had been on the edge of exposing Sterling, of saving everything, and that was when the trap had sprung. She closed the journal, her breath coming fast, her pulse roaring in her ears. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was evidence, proof. Her father hadn't been blind or careless. He had been silenced. Tears burned her eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, a cold, steady resolve settled in her chest. She rose and walked to the mirror hanging above her small dresser. Her reflection stared back at her, the starched uniform, the tired lines beneath her eyes, but also the storm inside her gaze. She wasn't just a waitress serving meals to men who thought they owned the world. She was the daughter of Jean-Luc Moreau, the man who had uncovered a lie too dangerous for Damian Sterling to allow. Now she held the journals in her hands. She held the truth. And she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that she would use it. For years she had waited. For years she had endured. But tonight, patience had transformed into purpose. The blade was drawn, and Claraara was ready to strike. The next morning, Claraara sat at the kitchen table with her father's journals spread before her like relics of a lost empire. The sun had barely risen, a pale light creeping through the thin curtains, casting shadows across the worn pages. She had read them again and again through the night until the words etched themselves into her mind. Proof. Not just suspicions, not just a daughter's grief, proof, but proof hidden in journals was powerless. Proof needed a voice, a stage, someone who could wield it in a world that had long ago shut its ears to the name Morrow. Her father's eyes followed her as she turned each page, his gaze sharp despite the weakness in his body. When she looked up, he gave the slightest nod, his good hand twitching with urgency. She understood him without words. It was time to act. But who could she trust? Who would believe her? A waitress in a black apron, claiming to hold the key to unraveling one of the art world's greatest scandals. The institutions had already condemned her father. The galleries had turned their backs. The investors had lined their pockets. The courts had ruled. No, she couldn't walk into a museum or a boardroom with these journals. She needed someone outside their reach, someone who didn't bow to money or reputation, someone who lived for truth. One name surfaced in her mind like a ghost from the margins of an old newspaper clipping: Arthur Finch. Years ago, when the scandal first broke, amidst the avalanche of articles calling her father a fraud, there had been one piece, just one, that raised questions. It hadn't defended Jean-Luc outright, but it had pointed out the convenient perfection of the evidence against him. It had hinted at a story too neat, too clean, almost rehearsed. The byline had read, Arthur Finch, senior investigative correspondent. Since then, she had heard little of him. He had retired or been pushed out. She couldn't be sure which. Rumors said he lived among books now, a recluse, his pen silenced but his mind still sharp. If anyone could see the truth in her father's notes, it was him. The search for him was harder than she expected. He was a ghost in the digital age, absent from social media, forgotten by the mainstream. But patience had always been her weapon. She combed through directories, old press club rosters, whispered names in cafe conversations until finally, one clue led to another. It ended at a dusty little bookstore in the East Village, tucked between a tattoo parlor and a boarded-up cafe. Its faded sign read, The Final Word. Claraara pushed open the door, and a bell jingled weakly above her. The smell of old paper and ink rushed over her, rich and comforting, like stepping into another era. Stacks of books towered precariously, forming narrow paths that led deeper into the shop. Behind the counter sat a man who looked as much a relic as the volumes around him. His clothes were rumpled, his gray hair unkempt, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he read a newspaper with the disinterested air of someone who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. "We close in 5 minutes," he muttered without looking up. His voice was gravelly, worn, tinged with a lifetime of cigarettes and cynicism. Claraara stepped closer, her storm-colored eyes steady. "Mr. Finch," she said softly but firmly, "my name is Claraara Morrow. My father was Jean-Luc Moreau." The newspaper lowered slowly, revealing a pair of pale blue eyes that cut sharper than glass. He studied her, his gaze sweeping over her uniform, the set of her jaw, the journals clutched in her hands. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something else. Interest. "I remember the name," he said, his voice cautious. "The scandal. The painting. The man who authenticated a lie." Claraara's grip tightened on the journals. "The man who was framed," she corrected, her tone fierce. She laid the leather-bound books on the counter, pushing them toward him. "These are his private notes, written before the scandal broke. They prove he knew the painting was a forgery. They prove Damian Sterling had everything to lose if the truth came out." For the first time, the mask of boredom slipped from Arthur Finch's face. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, his fingers brushing the edge of the leather cover with reverence. He opened one at random, scanning the elegant handwriting, his lips moving silently as he read. The lines around his mouth deepened, his expression hardening as the story unfolded across the pages. "A diary can be dismissed," he rasped after a long silence, though his tone lacked conviction. "Sterling will claim your father wrote it after the fact to save himself." "He couldn't have," Claraara countered swiftly. "He had the stroke 5 years ago. He hasn't been able to write his own name since. These are real-time entries, dated, detailed, and there's more. He describes a signature, a cross-hatching in the underdrawing, a mark left by a 20th century forger. He found it before anyone else. That's why Sterling silenced him. That's why he was ruined." Finch's eyes lit with something fierce, something hungry. The old instincts of a predator who once lived to expose men like Sterling flickered back to life. He turned another page, then another, his fingers trembling just slightly. When he looked up, the cynicism was gone. In its place was the sharp, dangerous focus of a man who smelled blood. "All right, kid," he said quietly, his voice low but thrumming with energy. "You've got my attention. But to take down a man like Sterling, we'll need more than notes. We'll need proof no one can ignore. Proof that screams in the faces of the powerful." Claraara's pulse quickened. She leaned in, her storm-gray eyes fierce. "Then let's get it. I'm done waiting." Finch studied her for a moment, then gave a slow, approving nod. "Good. Because you're about to step into a war, and Damian Sterling doesn't fight fair." The plan was audacious, even reckless, but Claraara felt no fear. Fear had been burned out of her years ago, replaced by something harder, sharper. Arthur Finch leaned across the cluttered counter of the final word, his voice low, his eyes glinting. "Sterling guards his empire like a fortress, but his ego? That's the door we walk through." Over the next days, the bookstore transformed into their war room. Piles of paper, photographs, and old press passes covered every inch of the counter. Arthur's phone, which normally rang for no one, buzzed constantly as he called in favors from ghosts of his past. A museum registrar who owed him a debt, a former FBI contact with a taste for scandal, even his estranged nephew Alistair, a young academic desperate for credibility. "Sterling's hired him to help catalog his collection," Arthur muttered, half amused, half contemptuous. "The boy thinks he's lucky. He has no idea he's wading into a swamp." Claraara listened, absorbing every detail. When Arthur finally told her the plan, her pulse kicked like thunder. She would go in as Anna, a freelance art photographer hired to assist Alistair. Her job was to document Sterling's treasures for insurance purposes. Her true mission? Capture forensic images of the alchemist's daughter, infrared shots that would reveal the cross-hatching her father had described, the forger's hidden signature buried beneath the paint. For 10 days, she prepared. She shed the skin of the waitress and built a new self. Anna wore intellectual elegance, black trousers, silk blouses in muted tones, horn-rimmed glasses that made her look older, detached, professional. She studied camera equipment until her fingers moved with the confidence of a veteran. She refreshed her knowledge of art conservation, practiced her cover story until it rolled off her tongue without hesitation. In the mirror, she no longer saw the girl who cleared tables at Ethelgard. She saw the daughter of Jean-Luc Morrow stepping into battle. The morning of the infiltration, the city was washed in pale sunlight, the streets humming with their endless rhythm. Claraara met Arthur for coffee in a tiny diner, his rumpled suit at odds with the sharp intensity in his eyes. "Remember," he said, stirring his black coffee absently, "you're not a vengeful daughter in there. You're Anna, detached, professional. You admire the art, not the man. Get the images and get out. Let him underestimate you. That's the weapon." Claraara nodded, her stomach tight with ice. Sterling's penthouse on Billionaire's Row was everything she had imagined, and worse. A sterile monument to wealth, towering windows swallowing the skyline, walls lined with masterpieces held hostage by money. Rothko, Bacon, even a small Picasso displayed like a trophy, but none of them commanded the room the way the alchemist's daughter did. It hung above the main gallery, illuminated as though it were holy, the lie that had destroyed her family elevated into an altar. Alistair Finch, nervous and overeager in his tweed jacket, introduced her quickly. "Mr. Sterling, this is Anna, the documentarian I told you about. Her work is, well, it's impeccable." Damian Sterling barely glanced at her. Dressed in a cashmere tracksuit, he exuded the smug confidence of a man who thought himself untouchable. His eyes flicked over Claraara with disinterest. No recognition, no suspicion. To him, she was invisible, another pair of hands validating his empire. Fine, he grunted, already turning back toward a massive screen of stock tickers. Alistair, supervise, make sure she doesn't touch anything. The dismissal was a gift. Claraara slipped into her role seamlessly. She photographed a few minor works first, setting up her tripod, adjusting the lights, creating the illusion of a meticulous professional doing her job. Her movements were calm, her voice clipped and clinical. Sterling barely noticed her. He wanted her there, but only as background noise to his greatness. And then, finally, she turned to the alchemist's daughter. Her breath caught. For years, she had seen it only in clippings and digital reproductions. In person, it was haunting. A young girl with downcast eyes, her face almost luminous in the dim light. Beautiful, deceptive, deadly. Given the importance of its provenance, I'll need multispectral imaging for the insurance records, Claraara said evenly, her voice carrying the flat authority of a specialist. Alistair nodded eagerly. Of course, of course. She adjusted her camera, switched to the infrared lens. Her hands moved with absolute precision, though inside, her heart hammered so violently she thought Sterling might hear it. She focused on the sleeve of the girl's dress, the place H. Her father had written about, the place where truth waited like a buried bone. At first, the painting was opaque, inscrutable, but as the camera processed the infrared light, the digital screen on her camera came alive. Beneath the painted folds, ghostly lines emerged. Her breath hitched. There it was, cross-hatching, faint but unmistakable, a geometric rhythm as distinct as a fingerprint, the forger's signature, the truth her father had been silenced for. Claraara's hands remained steady as she snapped photo after photo from every angle, her face a mask of professional detachment. Inside, fire consumed her. The proof was hers, the blade was sharp. She downloaded the images to an encrypted drive, wiped the camera's memory card clean, and slid the drive into her pocket. Her heartbeat thundered. She had done it. As she packed up, Damian Sterling finally strolled over, his glass of wine swirling lazily in his hand. He gestured at the painting with a proprietary smirk. Impressive, isn't it? My Vermeer. Claraara turned her head, her face smooth, her voice perfectly neutral. A most compelling piece, Mr. Sterling. A truly fascinating subject for analysis. It was the bloodless response of a professional. It was also a lie he swallowed whole. He nodded, satisfied, already turning away. Claraara followed Alistair to the door, the encrypted drive heavy in her pocket. She had walked into the lion's den, looked the monster in the eye, and stolen the weapon that would destroy him. As she stepped into the New York afternoon, the wind against her face, she felt it deep in her chest. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, Damian Sterling's empire would crumble. The invitation-only gala at the Metropolitan Museum was the crown jewel of Damian Sterling's year. On this night, he was not just a financier, he was a patron of the arts, a man draped in generosity and culture, a king holding court among New York's elite. The Temple of Dender glowed with soft golden lights, its ancient stone walls transformed into a stage for wealth and spectacle. Champagne flowed endlessly, laughter rang like music, and the air was heavy with the scent of orchids imported from Thailand just for the occasion. Claraara stood at the edge of the crowd, sapphire silk sweeping against the marble floor, her hair swept into a chignon so graceful it could have belonged to her mother decades ago. The pearls at her ears, her mother's, gleamed under the chandeliers. No one recognized her. To these people, she was just another guest, another elegant shadow in a sea of jewels and tuxedos. But she knew better. She wasn't here to mingle. She wasn't here to smile. She was here to strike. Beside her, Arthur Finch tugged at the collar of his rumpled suit, looking distinctly out of place among the polished donors. Yet his eyes, sharp, watchful, missed nothing. Remember, he murmured, his gravelly voice almost drowned out by the string quartet. You don't accuse tonight. You reveal. Calm, clinical. Let the evidence speak. Truth, not vengeance. That's what wins. Claraara nodded once, her storm-colored eyes never leaving the stage. Damian Sterling stood at the center of it, glowing under the spotlights. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his smile a gleaming blade. Isabel hung on his arm, diamonds dripping from her neck, her laughter chiming on cue. Around them clustered the city's wealthiest collectors, politicians, and media darlings. Sterling soaked in their admiration like a man drinking his own reflection. Ladies and gentlemen, he purred into the microphone, his voice smooth, practiced, intoxicating to those who had never seen the rot beneath it. It is the greatest honor of my life to give back to the arts that have given me so much. Tonight, I offer not just my resources, but my heart. And with that heart, I present a very special treasure from my personal collection. An assistant pulled a silk cloth from the easel at his side. Beneath it was a charcoal sketch, the supposed study for the alchemist's daughter. A murmur of awe swept the room, cameras flashing, whispers hissing like wind through reeds. Sterling's smile widened. The auctioneer launched into his chant and hands shot into the air. The bids climbed fast, 200,000, 3, 4, until the room swelled with feverish competition. Sterling stood watching, basking in triumph, each number that fell like a stone in the river of his arrogance. And then, wait. The single word was quiet, but it cut through the room like glass. The auctioneer faltered, his gavel frozen mid-air. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd, heads swiveling, whispers rising. Claraara stepped forward, her sapphire gown catching the light, her heels clicking against marble with measured grace. For a moment she seemed almost spectral, a figure conjured from memory. Every eye turned toward her. Sterling's smile faltered. "I am Claraara Morrow," she announced, her voice steady, resonant, impossible to ignore. The name landed with the weight of thunder. Gasps broke the silence. Whispers flared. Morrow? Jean-Luc Morrow's daughter? Damian's face drained of color. Claraara's gaze locked on him, unflinching, a storm meeting the man who had tried to bury it. "And as an art historian, I have a duty to inform you that the sketch you are bidding on is not what it pretends to be. It is not the hand of a 17th century mythopoeia. Aster. It is an accessory to fraud." Chaos stirred at the edges of the room. Sterling's mask cracked, his voice harsh and shrill. "Security! Remove this woman at once. She is delusional, the bitter daughter of a fraud who ruined himself." 2 guards stepped forward, but before they could touch her, Arthur Finch blocked their path, flashing his press credentials like a shield. "She has a right to speak, and you," he said sharply, his gaze slicing toward Sterling, "might want to hear what she has to say." Claraara's hand lifted, and with it, the screens flanking the stage flickered to life. The first image appeared, a page from her father's journal, his elegant script circling the date, the doubts, the warning about the lead-tin yellow pigment. Murmurs swept the crowd. The next image, the infrared photograph she had taken of the alchemist's daughter, the ghostly underdrawing glowing beneath the painted surface. The circled cross-hatching pulsed like a scar, a stylistic fingerprint, the signature of a known forger. "My father found this before anyone else," Claraara said, her voice clear, ringing with conviction. "He documented it. He was silenced before he could reveal it. This is the proof, scientific, unarguable, and it exposes Damian Sterling for what he truly is, not a patron of the arts, but a fraud who built his empire on lies." The room erupted, gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs. Reporters scribbled frantically, phones lifted, flashes exploded. Sterling's composure collapsed in real time. His face was slick with sweat, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning in air. "Lies!" he bellowed, his voice breaking. "This is all fabricated!" But the evidence glared back at him from the screens, undeniable, merciless. And then, from the side of the stage, another voice, trembling but clear. Alistair Finch stepped forward, pale, his hands shaking as he held up a tablet. "Your own financial records," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned room. "A payment of $2 million to a shell corporation. 2 days before Jean-Luc Morrow was accused, that corporation was traced to the firm that produced the fraudulent report. You framed him, you destroyed him." The gala dissolved into chaos. Sterling shouted, denied, sputtered, but the storm had broken. His empire of lies was unraveling under the hot lights, and for the first time in his life, the king of finance stood alone, naked in his ruin. Claraara held his gaze from the floor, her storm-colored eyes steady, her voice soft but devastating. "You thought I was invisible. You thought you could bury us. But the truth has a longer memory than you. And tonight, it speaks." The doors at the back opened. Detectives entered, calm, inevitable. The crowd parted. Sterling's empire was finished. The Temple of Dendur had never seen silence like this. One moment it had been a stage for wealth and applause. The next, it was a tribunal. The marble floor gleamed under the harsh light, but all the glitter had gone out of the room. Damian Sterling stood on the stage, his tuxedo clinging to him like a costume that no longer fit. Sweat slicked his forehead, his smirk erased, his eyes wide and darting like a trapped animal. The detectives moved forward, not in a rush, not with shouts or chaos, but with the slow, inexorable weight of inevitability. Their polished shoes echoed against stone, their badges catching the light. The crowd parted as though the air itself had split, whispers rippling like wind through tall grass. Sterling's friends, The politicians, the donors, the socialites moved back, their manicured hands clutching champagne flutes now forgotten. No one stepped in to defend him, not one. Damian Sterling, one of the detectives said, his voice calm but carrying like a bell. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. The words landed like a gavel. No, Sterling shouted, his voice cracking, desperate. This is lies, all of it. You. He jabbed a trembling finger toward Claraara. You did this, you. Claraara stood in the aisle, sapphire silk pooling around her like a banner of defiance. Her storm-gray eyes locked onto his, unflinching. No, she said softly, yet the word cut through the hall. The truth did this. 2 officers stepped onto the stage. Sterling twisted, tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. His movements were jerky, graceless, the swagger gone, replaced by panic. Isabel had already slipped away into the crowd, diamonds flashing as she clutched her bag, her face pale with the sudden knowledge that she had backed the wrong king. The handcuffs clicked around Sterling's wrists, the metallic sound echoing through the cavernous space like thunder. His empire, the one he had built on lies, intimidation, and greed, collapsed in that single sound. The man who once commanded boardrooms and auction houses stood shackled before the very people who had cheered him only minutes earlier. The crowd erupted, half in gasps, half in murmurs, phones snapping photos, reporters whispering frantically into recorders. For years they had fed on his wealth, his image. Now they feasted on his downfall. Claraara's chest tightened, but not with triumph. What she felt was something deeper, older, like the closing of a wound that had bled too long. She thought of her father, trapped in his silent body, his brilliance locked behind broken speech. She thought of her mother, fragile and pale, clinging to memories of salons and gardens long gone. She thought of the little girl she once was, attending galas with her parents, never imagining that one day she would stand here as their avenger. As Sterling was led down the steps, his head bowed, his jaw clenched, Claraara whispered the words that only she and her father would truly understand, words in perfect French. Justice, enfin, justice, at last. Arthur Finch appeared at her side, his rumpled suit at odds with the fire in his eyes. You did it, he rasped. You actually did it. No, Claraara said, her voice quiet but steady, her gaze still on Sterling as the detectives guided him out. We did it. My father did it. The truth did it. She knew this was not the end. Trials would come, headlines would roar, investors would scramble to salvage their fortunes. But Sterling's power was broken. His empire of glass had shattered under the weight of one undeniable fact. Lies cannot outlast truth. In the weeks that followed, the name Morrow returned to the art world, not as a stain, but as a banner. John Luke's journals were published, his reputation restored. Scholars who had once turned away now praised his brilliance, his integrity. Claraara established the Morrow Foundation, dedicated to protecting artists and exposing fraud, ensuring no one would suffer as her family had. At night, she often sat beside her father's wheelchair, reading to him from the newspapers that now spoke his name with respect. Though his voice was gone, his eyes told her everything, the pride, the relief, the peace, and sometimes, just sometimes, a tear would trace down his cheek. As for Claraara, she no longer saw herself as a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had cast her out. She was something else now, an avenger turned guardian, a woman forged by loss into a weapon of truth. And when she thought back to the night Sterling tried to humiliate her with broken French, she smiled, not with joy, not with vengeance, but with the quiet, steady satisfaction of someone who had finally seen justice done. Because in the end, wealth could build towers of glass, but it could not build character. True power was not in money or titles, it was in dignity, in patience, in courage. And Claraara Morrow had all three,